How's it going, everybody? So I wanted to make a video and take a few minutes to talk about this cycle of anxiety. I'm sure many of you are aware, if you're experiencing it, that it kind of comes unexpectedly sometimes, or maybe you kind of feel it coming and then it kind of fades away for a little bit. And so I want to take a few minutes to kind of break down this cycle a little bit. That way you can kind of get a little bit of a head start. You can see what's around the corner. And also, this is fundamentally important if you're going to try to make progress and work with it. So to start with, the obvious one, we're going to start here at trigger or presentation. What this means is that, obviously if you have anxiety and you're experiencing a trigger, that's where this is right here. This is where things that are being presented to you are causing a panic attack, right? And what this ultimately boils down to is that in the cycle, you see that the same things get presented, the same things are triggered, and it's trying to get to you, and that's what the panic attack is, right? So after you experience the panic attack, however you get through that is how you get through it. There's lots of information out there for that. But the next point is that you're going to go down here to avoid and suppress. So at this stage, usually people, after they experience a panic attack for the first or 1,000th time, is they're going to be more careful. They're going to really avoid their triggers. They're going to play it safe. They're going to try to push away from the anxiety itself. They want some more space. They want to be able to breathe some more, right? And that's just a natural reaction in most cases. So after you've done this, after you kind of suppress the emotions, or you're avoiding your triggers, you're avoiding the circumstances that can make you susceptible to panic or anxiety, what happens is then we come over here to ferment or pressure. So what this means is that all of the emotions or issues that were suppressed initially are now starting to ferment, because they didn't just go away. We all know that avoiding it is not going to make it disappear. So it starts to kind of like bubble up and ferment a little bit. This also is going to build some pressure. What that means is that these issues that the anxiety is presenting is going to start to slowly build pressure until we get right back over here again to presentation. So you can see when this cycle, there's three main parts here. And you can probably relate your personal experience to how this works for you. Everybody's triggers is going to be a little different. Everybody's avoidance and time spent in fermentation, or how often you're triggered or how severely you're triggered. These are all going to be unique for each individuals. But this is the generic process and cycle of anxiety. And so you can see how this kind of very easily flows from one point to the next, which is part of why it's so difficult to deal with. And so if you look over here, I have this high and low scale. What I'm equating this to is your level of anxiety. So obviously when you're having a panic attack or you're triggered, you're going to have a very high anxiety level. And then while you're avoiding or suppressing or getting some more space, that's going to kind of lower your anxiety level. That's where you're just feeling a little bit better. You're starting to kind of recover a little bit. And so down here at the bottom, in between this avoid, suppress, and the ferment pressure, is where you're at your lowest anxiety level. And of course, as it starts to ferment and build up pressure, it's going to climb back over here to high, and that's going to help initiate that trigger. So I want to make a couple of real quick points here. So like I said, this top part is the panic attack. As far as avoidance and suppression, we could probably say, agoraphobia would be an extreme version of that. But to some degree or another, all of our avoidance of anxiety is some degree of agoraphobia. So I'll put that over here. Or you know what, I'll just put phobia. Because depending on your unique triggers, that's going to be different for everybody. And then of course over here we're going to have patterns. So what do I mean by patterns? What this is saying is that the patterns that you have in your daily life or your weekly life is what helps contribute to this fermentation and this pressure that's building up and that's causing your anxiety to go up. So a lot of the work that you can do is not initially going to be up here during the panic attack. It's usually going to be down here with your patterns. The issue is that since we're coming off of a low anxiety level, right? And so we're going back to our old patterns. And these patterns are causing these issues to ferment, and it's causing it to build up pressure, and that's eventually leading us back over here. So we know that our patterns change a little bit when we're over here in a void, because we're changing things up, we're being a little bit more careful, and depending on how your triggers are growing or overlapping, then you're going to change your patterns a little bit until you kind of recover a little bit. And that's the next portion I want to talk about, is the energy loss and gain of each of these areas. So obviously, while you're having a panic attack or you're experiencing a trigger, you're going to have a high loss. So what that means is that the mental, physical, emotional energy that you have, as you know, or maybe your life force, if you will, those things are going to be at a high loss while you're having a panic attack or while you're being triggered, right? Because what happens during a panic attack is that you freak out. Your body is having a flight or fight response. So both mentally and physically, you're being drained. It's a very exhausting experience. I'm sure many of you can agree with that and have experienced that. So we're losing a lot of our vitality at this point. So while we're over here, we're in the avoid suppress. After we have the our triggers, and we're over here in avoid and suppress, we're trying to recover, right? So I'm going to write recover right there. And like I said, our patterns are going to change a little bit in this area because we're doing a little bit more avoidance. We're trying to recover. We don't want to deal with those things. We're too exhausted from this high loss of energy. So we're going to a more phobia state of being where we're trying to recover that energy. And that's also what happens right over here when we get to this point. This is when we actually start to lose energy again. So I'm going to put low loss here, because our patterns that we have in our daily lives are causing a slow loss of energy. It's nothing nearly like what we experience during an actual panic attack or during a trigger, but what that is that we're not aware of it, right? We're going about our daily lives, but we're actually losing energy. Depending on your belief system, this is completely up to you on how you define it. We can go strictly scientific and say your physical energy. We know that panic attacks are causing a flight or fight response. It's very physically draining. Obviously, it's going to be very mentally draining as well. You're caught up in your head, running around in circles there. For a more esoteric type of energy, we can definitely go with something more like life force, chi, jing, if you're into that. So you can kind of correlate this to what works for you. The definition isn't important. What's important is that whatever you define as energy or vitality in your life, realizing how each point in this circle or this cycle, what's happening to that energy. And the point of all of this is to kind of get you aware, to get you in tune with what's happening. Because too often we get into this cycle, especially right here when we're in this fermentation area, we're not really thinking about the anxiety. Because we've just come off of this phobia state where we're very tense. We're trying to back off a little bit and relax a little. And so we're trying to just enjoy this time that we have where we're not experiencing anxiety. And that's perfectly normal. The issue is that we're back into that relaxed state, we're following our old patterns, but we're losing energy there. So the issue is that we want to try to see what's happening in each of these phases. That way we can recognize what stage that we're at in this cycle. And depending on what stage that we're at is depending on the action that we can take to help improve this. For myself personally, anxiety has, my triggers have changed. They started out with one trigger, and then they kind of latch on to a new trigger, and then they kind of latch on to a new trigger. I think I've probably got about 4 or 5 different unique triggers at this point when it was originally just one. So my point is that this cycle is actually more like a spiral, right? If we're not actively participating in this cycle, if we're not working to deal with this or to make progress in this, it's going to kind of close that gap and make it shorter cycles, right? At that point, it can get a lot more extreme, where you're actually needing to go see a psychiatrist or possibly get on medication, those types of things for more extreme scenarios. Our goal is to actually reverse this because we want to make this circle wider, right? Because we want to have more time in each of these areas and more balance so that we can start to work with it progressively. on this page and the way that I'm trying to coach with you, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in the panic attack area. And the reason for that is that there is 1,001 ways that you can deal with a panic attack, that you can cope with it. And there's a plethora of information online about that. I've never had a hard time finding a way to deal with the panic attack. That being said, what I have seen is that sometimes the techniques or things that we will do in order to cope with the panic attack can also kind of become its own pattern, in the sense that for a while I would try to meditate whenever I was starting to experience anxiety or being triggered. And what eventually happened was that if the trigger was more severe or I was more susceptible to it, then that act of meditating actually became part of the trigger, in the sense that, oh, this isn't working like it usually does. And so then it kind of feeds back into that loop, right? And so what we're trying to do is make a little bit bigger circle. Like I said, we won't spend a lot of time. I'm not going to work with you too much on this trigger. I mean, obviously I will be here for you guys. If you need somebody to talk to, I'm more than happy to help. But there's a plethora of information out there on that. I recommend you can do your own research as well on that. But this is not usually where we're going to do a lot of work. And the reason is many people will say that a lot of stuff you come across online is, go and face your fears. Go and be with your trigger and sit through that. And while there is a time and place for that, it's typically not where you should start. Because if you're spiraling down and your anxiety is kind of getting worse, it's kind of changing and making new triggers, for instance. Going straight to dealing with your triggers directly is not always the best way to deal with it. That may work for some people. From my experience, that did not work for me. And I imagine that for most people, that's not really the best idea. Because if you're trying to deal with your trigger on a high loss area, you have high anxiety, and you've got low energy because of all this loss right here, how much effort do you think you can actually put into consciously dealing with your triggers? It's a lot more difficult. So most of what we're actually going to be working on is going to be in these two areas, because this is the low anxiety region. And what that means is that you can take and you can widen this circle a little bit. You can get a little bit more time in these areas, and that's going to give you a little bit more energy and a little bit more of a snowball effect, in a sense, to kind of work on these issues. Because I think it's important to understand why the anxiety comes around, what the anxiety is trying to tell you, and to have a little bit extra energy in order to deal with those things before you get to this point. I'm not saying that you won't get to this point, because we all do. I don't think that the idea of overcoming anxiety completely is really appropriate. I think that on some level it's always going to be there, but I do believe that we should be able to integrate it and be able to work with it to where it's not a drain on our life, but actually can become friends with the anxiety. But that concept is so far out there if you're trying to start right here. So guys, this is kind of my breakdown of the cycle of anxiety. I'm just kind of like laying a little bit of groundwork here for you. This is going to be pretty prevalent in a lot of the videos that I make. I'm going to make references to this a lot. And if you have any questions as far as, if you want a little bit more breakdown about some of these things, or maybe you're not sure where you fit in on this or how your cycle looks compared to this, put a comment in the video if you feel, or if you want to do it privately, you can send me a private message on the page. But in any case, I hope this kind of helps you get a little bit more grasp and understanding as far as what's going on, and that way you can start to make progress and work with it. Have a good one, guys. I'll see you next time.